On the topic of power and pretty much everything, my favorite ideas are the ones that at first seem counterintuitive or crazy or confusing, but upon reflection make perfect sense. The topic of my talk today is hide your power. And the idea of hiding our power, again, seems kind of crazy and confusing until you realize that is what we always do with power. We pretty much always hide our power. The idea of great power sounds nice, but what we actually want is precisely the amount of power we need, even the minimum amount of power we need, and only when we need it. We hide it and channel it so we have access to it, but in very limited and specific ways. We pay electricians and plumbers to carefully integrate wires and pipes so that we have power and water only when we flip a switch or plug in a device or turn a faucet. Most of our cars run on internal combustion engines, which are literally controlled explosions only a few feet in front of where we're sitting. The very existence of life on our planet depends on us being in precise relationship to the sun, which is a nuclear fusion reactor. We live in the Goldilocks zone, and the tiniest tilt spells the difference between a scorching desert or a frigid wasteland. Our own nuclear reactors, which run on fission, splitting atoms rather than squishing them together, create efficient energy while requiring tremendous care. So there are words for power that has no limits: catastrophe and disaster, floods, earthquakes, forest fires, and other natural disasters show us what happens when power goes unchecked. This is what much of social infrastructure is: channeling power to a point where it is productive and the right amount dangerous. And so it is in our own lives. The best thing we can do with our own power is to hide our power until it is needed and to channel it where it is the most useful. There's a word for power that is potent, yet safe, gentle, and effective. It's mastery. And mastery is this hidden, effective power that I want to talk about. Those of us who have lived for a while understand, and I think all of us intuitively understand, that those who boast and brag are actually showing off because they're insecure. They have to show off their power because they aren't confident in their power, or worse, because their power is counterfeit. They don't actually have the power of which they boast. The insecure boast with their words because they can't prove themselves with actions. We often flex our power when we are trying to hide our weaknesses and deficits. We flex our power when we are trying to control others. For example, we often yell because we fail to persuade. We berate because we fail to face our own flaws. We put others down because we are not sure of our own standing. Most fundamentally, we flex our power when we have failed to master ourselves. Let me say that again. We flex our power when we have failed to master ourselves. Self-mastery is not conflict-based, beating ourselves up, not good enough. Healthy claiming of our power begins with acceptance of who we are, of all our traits. Once we have an honest relationship with our reality, we can invest in what is real rather than wasting energy convincing ourselves and convincing others that we really are good enough or even perfect. Let me just tell you and tell you and tell you that I'm good enough. I've spoken on healthy celebration, which we should embrace, but we also need to acknowledge that we live in a society of toxic showing off, mostly on social media. The flood of likes and dislikes, of filtered, highlighted performance sets up impossible expectations. Social sharing triggers a need for approval and a fear of disapproval that can feel like 1,000 paper cuts, and none of us are prepared for that. Social media affirmation remains thin and fickle while eroding deeper connections that we need to survive and thrive. Jesus also lived within a toxic culture of status and inequality. Roman culture was built almost entirely on hierarchies of status and power, and Jewish religion was built around the idea of concentric circles of holiness. Jesus subversively shattered both of these expectations as he taught that the way to rule was to serve, and the loving outsider was closer to God than the most exalted religious leader. Jesus taught, "You know that those who are considered rulers of the Gentiles lord it over them, and their great ones exercise authority over them. But it should not be among you. So whoever would be great among you must be your servant, and whoever would be first among you must be the slave of all. For even the Son of Man came not to be served, but to serve, and to give his life as a ransom for many." And then in Luke, he teaches as far as where to sit at a banquet. When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him, and he who invited you both will come and say to you, "Give your place to this person." And then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, "Friend, move up higher." Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted. The most dramatic reversal of privilege and power lies hidden in the parable of the Good Samaritan. Because you can only understand this parable when you understand Jewish religion of the time. Why did the priest cross the road? Ironically, this is not a parable about being helpful. This is a parable about status, religion, and holiness. The priest and the Levite, as you may be aware, were held to the standards of their holiness and something called corpse impurity. They could not touch a dead body that was not a member of their own family. And so when they saw the person beaten and left for dead, they did not see the person. They saw a potential corpse. That person was not alive to them with love. That person was based in fear, potentially dead. And thus they did not see the person in need of help. They saw the potential corpse that could potentially endanger their own sense of their own holiness. And so ironically, Jesus was saying, this stranger, this Samaritan, is more holy because he is in a position to help and heal, rather than these so-called holy priests and Levites who are so caught up in their idea of holiness that they cannot help and heal. Let's talk about putting power into practice. It is worth noting in general that the powerful need to quiet themselves and the marginalized deserve to speak up. Very similar to the way that Jesus says, those who are humble will be exalted, and those who are exalted by society should be quiet and stop manspreading. Managing our own power is more a matter of training and practice than learning. I'm fortunate that chaplain training is literal character mastery. The whole point of ministerial training is to master our own being to the level where we can be quiet, we can be still, and we can facilitate what others are going through. The minister hides their own influence and quiets their own needs so that they can become a channel to the flow of health and life, as I discussed the last time. I also want to talk about putting power in the present. One of my strengths, weaknesses, is that I can get so excited about my plans for the future that I can get a bit lost in the work of the present. So one thing that I've done is I love to-do lists. This is my to-do notebook that I write in every day. And I was noticing that too often my little boxes would go unchecked. And then I felt badly about myself. So what I did is I made a new notebook for my intentions, what I want to get done during the day. So I write down my intentions, and here's the secret. I only check it in my to-do notebook when it is already done. And thus, this is not a to-do notebook, it is a done notebook. And this is an approach that I've begun to put into practice in my own life. So for example, I can get really, really excited again about my plans and what I'm planning on doing, but I am working on my sharing, including on social media. So I only share something when it is already done, when it's already real, and maybe not even then, because I don't need to. One of my very favorite passages in the New Testament is where Jesus teaches, "For which of you desiring to build a tower does not first sit down and count the cost, whether they have enough to complete it? Otherwise, when they have begun to lay a foundation and is not able to finish, all who see it begin to mock them, saying, 'This person begun to build and was not able to finish.' Therefore, any of you who does not renounce all that they have cannot be my disciple." So let's finish by talking about some people who have to hide their power. I want to talk about martial arts and special forces. In martial arts, the purpose of martial arts is not to use them. Martial arts masters train countless hours with the hope that they will never need to put into practice the skills they spar. Think about that. The purpose of martial arts is to become so powerful and so mastered that we know that if needed, we could do pretty much anything we needed. But we don't need to show off until that moment. Special forces is even more interesting. I admit that I feel drawn to and fascinated by special forces. I'll talk about my future for just a moment. I will be putting in my packet for the National Guard at the end of this month. And two of my greatest goals for National Guard chaplaincy is that I want to be a special forces chaplain. When I was very depressed in 2016 after my second divorce, the idea that got me out of bed was the idea of being a military chaplain. And as I've shared before, I knew that I didn't want to go active duty, but I loved the idea of being a military chaplain. And so I reached out to one of my closest friends and I said, "Are there part-time military chaplains?" And he said, "Not only are there part-time military chaplains, there are part-time special forces military chaplains." And that has put me on the path that I'm on today. Recently, I learned about social science special forces, psyops, and civil affairs that are surprisingly kind of like Jedi and Sith. But special forces' relationship to power is even more paradoxical than the black belt. Special forces are some of the most trained specialists in existence, but their success depends on them hiding their power. If people recognize their power, they fail. Their missions depend on them being unremarkable, depend on them going unnoticed until it is time to explode into action just the right amount. And so I'll conclude by talking about plugging into our power. When we master hiding our power, master quieting our presence, gaining the strength to be silent, we can channel that power for maximum effectiveness. One of my favorite descriptions I have ever heard in unity is that we are the divine in a limited expression, the infinite expressing itself in the particular. We are eternity experiencing a few precious moments, infinity looking through the window of subjective perception. The divine within us invites us to become emotional martial artists, spiritual special forces. I want us all to master our power so that when we radiate it, quietly, being present when needed, never needing to flex or flash it otherwise, we master the power to be quiet and still. When we have that mastery, we can plug in cleanly to the present, to the divine, to the flow of life. We become conduits of divine power so that we can facilitate the network of love and life of which we are all part. We plug ourselves into process and relationship so that as we demonstrate and implement our power to the precise point it is needed and effective, our measured power and strength heals the world. My prayer is that we can hide our power effectively so that we can show it fully as needed. When we master this quiet power, our power becomes a clean fusion reactor of well-being. Amen.